Chapter 9. In the Shadow of Fear. Anyi found himself in a field, sand on his feet and nothing to see as far as the eyes could stretch. Then suddenly, a man began to run towards him. It was a fellow villager, a soldier from the spear in his hand and marks on his face. He wore a breastplate too, crafted from hard leather with ropes for straps. He screamed something, but Anyi could not hear it. Soon, another soldier came running, then another, and then another, until like a swarm of ants they flocked, some on horseback, most on foot. A crack sounded in the distance from the opposite side. A loud crack that broke through his ear. He turned to see where it had come from, but his eyes were met only with blackness, a deep blackness that seemed to have blinded him and then sipped into his nostril and throat. Breathe. He gasped, and he gasped again, and then he snapped out of his bed. On waking, he found that the darkness did not leave him, nor the tightening he was starting to feel around his neck. He let out a scream, but immediately a hand was clasped to gag his mouth. The darkness and the claustrophobia it sparked sent him into a panic. This, too, was futile as an assailant with obvious overbearing strength crushed him to stillness in the grip of an arm. Breathe. Breathe. He could feel his lungs threatening to give, and his heart drummed so hard it hurt with each stroke. Breathe. Breathe. He repeated the word and tried to center himself. He pictured himself holding a bow with an arrow in the nook. A target was in the distance. So far it appeared only like a speck with no real shape or form. It didn't matter if it was an abstract projection from his mind. It only mattered that it was small and that it shifted its shape too. It was a technique his father had taught him on his first day using the bow. The older man had said then that fear itself was the ultimate weakness, of missing the shot and of being prey to predators. Breathe, breathe. If he could learn to redirect his focus, the fear would starve to death. Breathe, breathe. Some calm was finally finding him. He felt an itch in his nostril, and his head swayed in the blackness. He tried to move his limbs, but both arms and legs felt as heavy as sacks of rice, as stiff as rocks. He bit down on his tongue and tasted iron. This was no dream, so why was this happening? A stab of panic struck in his heart, and in that moment he gave in, surrendering his every being to the black that called at him. When Anyi was awake again, the night whistled with the hooting of owls, and the growl of a beast could be heard in the distance too. His eyes fluttered, and he rubbed his neck in search of the tautness that once was. He felt nothing. Immediately, he sprang to his feet. Where his softer sleeping mat once was, there was now only hard clay, a black cloth bag with strings resting by his side. He looked around, to his left, and then to his right. It was just him and the strange mbari he was being kept in. Normal mbaris he was used to, large houses built in honor of the spirits filled with sculptures like sacred animals, and conceptions of various spirits carved from wood or styled with clay. They normally had a clear altar too, with torches, kola nuts, and other such sacred items laid out. This one did not look like the home to any spirit he could recognize, because there were no symbols to point to. No ram horns, no elephant tusks, no carvings of Ayla with her naked breasts feeding men and animals. Instead, there were masks, wood carved and augmented with raffia threads for manes. There were weapons too, swords, spears, axes, and battle drums. Anyi thought of his father, but he knew the man was nowhere near. How was it possible that he could have been kidnapped from right under their roof? Perhaps it was the pigmen, or... Then it hit him. Ekpe, someone should have warned him. But then he should have known this was coming. It was only a question of when. Something moved in the dark, and he turned to see what. Whatever it was in the darkest corner of the room, and it held still as a leafless tree in the moonlight. He wondered if he had seen it move or if he had imagined it. He looked around. Nothing else seemed to be alive. Now his heart was starting to pound again, and the chant of breathing did not seem to clam him either. Anyi moved to the closest weapon, a sword maybe the length of his leg. The handle was carved with a good wooden finish, but he bothered little to inspect the craftsmanship. With slow and trembling steps, he approached the shadow, his stomach queasy with a feeling so eerie fear didn't quite describe it. Only if he had an oil torch. The moonlight had made this place a bed of shadows, making it impossible to see too further ahead of one's nose. Anyi made it close enough to the corner he had detected movement, leaving maybe 5 paces to cover. He tightened his grip on the weapon. There was another twitch in the shadows, and then it sprang at him, with the speed of a leopard. The weapon he thought would protect him was the first thing he dropped. Without thinking at all, he began to run. This was no masquerade like the ones he had seen. This one was very different. Black in every conceivable way, save the white, sharp teeth, blood-red tongue, and wide, scary eyes. In its hand, it carried a weapon too, the double-curved ceremonial weapon of kings and great warriors. As the folktales had it, such a weapon was to be swung only when death was desired. Any other use was an abomination. Anyi could feel his legs and how fast they moved. In his mind, it should have been impossible for anyone to catch up with him. However, outside of his mind, in the real world, the footsteps of the black masquerade could be heard. With each step, it felt like the creature drew near and nearer, and then there was silence. Anyi did not stop. He dared not to even look back. He had since left the strange mbari, but there was no comfort to be found in the bushes that waited outside. It was still dark. The owls still hooted, and bats cried too. But the scariest of all was the growling and how it felt near and far all at once. Anyi did not stop until he found a large tree trunk and chose to hide behind it. Suddenly, he was more aware of the chill in the night, and that it made his breath misty. His bare foot scratched the clay beneath him as he panted to catch his breath. Wide-eyed, he feared even to blink, and his ears darted in every direction in the bush. He recalled his lessons from hunting, the need to listen for the rustle of leaves and the snapping of twigs. This was no bushmeat hunt, but he had nothing else to lean on. Soon enough, the breath he had lost was back in his lungs again, and he appeared to breathe with relative ease. The panic was far from over, though. The growling that once was just a noise now appeared in the form of a panther, or as the people of Eke like to call it, Agu Oji, the night leopard. The large cat moved with gentle strides, its motion oozing with power it never had to assert. In the dark, it was even darker, 2 pairs of green eyes hovering like lamps to see with. Anyi did not move. He knew enough to know what would happen if he did. The masquerade had been fast, and he might have been faster, but with this, he did not have a running chance. Not even if he tried to make it up a tree. The panther stopped no more than 3 paces away, with a still tail and an intense stare only broken by a flash of its red tongue licking white, sharp teeth. Anyi wanted to take a step back, but the tree trunk that once brought him safety was now a prison. The creature growled again, but this time he was all out of fear. Anyi growled back, and then bared his teeth with a face twisted in rage. He did not have a weapon in hand, but if this animal thought he would go quietly, then it would have to try harder than a few growls. The panther showed its teeth in return, but Anyi did not retreat. Instead, he advanced, taking steps closer, until not even a foot separated his face from the beast's. To his initial shock, the animal took a step back. This was no time to show relief or celebrate victory. He made more sounds, beating his chest like he had watched the Gidigbo wrestlers do, to intimidate their opponent. Perhaps it would make the panther think him a gorilla. He should have grabbed a mask when he had the chance in the mbari. Regardless, he did not back down. The panther was now silent, still slowly moving backwards as he advanced. A few paces later, it turned around and ran off into the night. Anyi still raged, his muscles taut and nostrils flaring. Some leaves rustled and a twig snapped. The masquerade. He did not wait. He moved again. Only if he had a sword. Anything but his bare hands. He wouldn't be able to fool a masquerade into thinking he was a gorilla, and with his bare fists he did not stand a chance. Anyi did not run too fast, afraid that he would tire himself. The moonlight was not the brightest, but it was enough to track himself back to the mbari. He only had to follow his prince and the prince of the Black Masquerade when they were reunited. The place was as he had left it, so he wasted no time in donning a raffia-manned mask and grabbing a long spear. In his mind he went over battle scenarios, but he had not imagined he would be required to display his imagination so soon. As he turned to leave, the door was covered, the masquerade standing with legs planted apart and death sword in hand. "If I die, so be it." Anyi ran at it, screaming a battle wail that had the weight of his entire being behind it. The pointed end of his spear took the lead, aimed straight at his adversary. With a single swing of its death sword, his attack was diverted, sending his spear into the wooden door frame. He pulled, but he was not fast enough. The masquerade stretched out its leg and kicked him straight on the chest. The power sent him rolling, but it had not hurt him in the way he might have imagined. At least he did not feel like a bone was broken. The masquerade ran at him with its sword raised for a slash. He avoided it with 2 rolls to the left, but the sound of hardened bronze on hard clay rattled in his ears. The masquerade attacked again with another swing, and again Anyi rolled to the side to evade. He shot back on his feet, eyes glued to the masked figure that now moved around him in a fearful taunt. He was glad that he too now wore a mask, something to cover his fear. His eyes moved to the door and then windows. He wanted to run, but then the recent memory of his rage against the panther emboldened his spirit. The battle continued with the masquerade swinging at him. With the weight of the ceremonial death sword, even the strongest of men found their swings slowed down to a half of the usual speed. This was all the time that Anyi needed, but he couldn't fight on the defensive forever. He ducked a swing for his head and jumped back to avoid a jab. Now it felt as though death was in the darkness, slowly eating away at him like rust to iron. His ear pulsed with the beat of his heart, and in his mind pictures flickered. Small Ozzy, Akpi, his little brother, his mother placing Akara and Pap in his bowl, his father showing him how to string a bow, and then Anyi and they, way she called his name twice in her bold voice, Anyi, Anyi. He flew at it with everything he had. He would not die in the hands of a masquerade on his first night in Ekpe grounds. His arms wrapped around the masquerade's waist, and mimicking the fights he had seen, he tried to lift it off the ground for a body slam. It worked. The masquerade's feet left the ground and he pushed it to the floor. "Anyi!" It was his father's voice.